But clearly they must have had notice of this letter from the lawyer at least an hour or so before its release. And whether they had it in time to when they saw the police, we simply don't know. I mean, I think some of us have not actually jumped to any conclusion about whether the BBC handled the case, their investigation properly, because we simply didn't know what the original complaint was, and therefore you couldn't really judge their performance until you knew what were they told when. I personally thought that the story today would become, is the story true or not? And my forecast was that if there was evidence of bank transfers from the presenter to the young person, that would be, in a sense, a crucial element. And if there wasn't, that would be a crucial moment in the story. But in fact, to be blunt, the story's got more muddy now, hasn't it? And we don't quite know who's saying what. But I think in that sense, it's almost fortunate now it's in the hands of the police.
Well, as you say, the police will have to get to the bottom of that. Just what about, Stuart, the role of social media in all this? Because you say, you know, muddying the waters. It's everything happens so quickly. And, you know, these sort of stories get legs very quickly, you know, on social media.
They do, and I think anyone who made any kind of accusation on social media against any BBC presenter, or indeed anybody else, is really now on notice to know that there will be lawyers coming for them. That's pretty much what some BBC presenters have said. And of course, they will now, if they were in a sense relying on the Sun's journalism to support them, well, they may have pause for thought about that. I had been surprised all along that the Sun never showed any paper evidence, shall we say, no paper trail, such as a bank statement to support their allegations. But they are, if you like, as you said, standing by their journalism. And this is actually a pretty big moment for British tabloid journalism as much as it is for the BBC.
Yeah, and just, I know you've got to go, Stuart, just very briefly, do you see there's an issue, you know, political issue between the Sun and the BBC and their, you know, the Sun's attitude to the BBC?
I don't think so. I mean, for instance, the Sun, for some reason, did not name the person when 5-10 years ago they would have certainly put a name in an allegation. So there are changing times in these things. But I'm sure that over at News UK headquarters, there are some anxious concerns going around the newsroom and indeed around the legal office at the moment.
OK, Stuart, thank you very much indeed for coming on. Thank you. Right, let's speak to the public relations expert, Kevin Craig, who joins us now. Kevin, thanks for being with us. Well, I just wonder what you make of this development. We've got this letter from the lawyer of the young person to the BBC, and then the Sun coming back on this. What do you make of it?
I'm actually shocked, Mark, that the Sun went ahead and published a story going against the, denied by the person at the centre of it. And, I am staggered as somebody who's worked in crises for over 3 decades that we have a statement that comes out that says tonight, for the avoidance of doubt, the allegations reported in the Sun newspaper are rubbish. And it is a reminder of something I've been saying in the last 48 hours, that this crisis hitherto has had no evidence or facts behind it. This is not a plane crash. This is not the aftermath of a disaster or attack. Totally hitherto unfounded speculation, attacks at the national broadcaster, the People's Channel, funded by and accountable to the people, and a real moment now of accountability for one of our national newspapers. And I'm really pleased that we've got the injection at last of some real fact, evidence and statement and affirmation into a story that was basically the Wild West of speculation, which has the potential to ruin lives, Mark.
Yeah, but we don't know, I have to say, we don't know what else the Sun newspaper has, Kevin. And also, I suppose the point is, this is a letter from the lawyer of the young person. The information the Sun seemed to have was got from the mother.
See, you said it there, though, Mark, and yourself, the journalistic legend, seemed to have everything is in speech marks. There's no facts. there's no certainty, and the national broadcaster should indeed, as the Secretary of State for Culture said, be given the time to fully investigate. The police have said today at the moment there's no inquiry, and as I say, I've been dealing with crises for decades. You normally have some facts and some evidence of what's happened. And this now is incredible. The ball is back in the Sun's court. It really is.
Well, in some ways, the ball is in the police's court, because the police have now said they're going to look at the information and assess that information to see if there has been a criminal offence here. So the police will obviously be looking at, bank records and so forth and other stuff. And so I suppose from the BBC's point of view, they can say, well, look, the police are now going to get to the bottom and see what's gone on.
Yeah, look, the BBC still has to operate under the 7 principles of public life. The Director General, the Group Council, they have to do their job. But all along, a reasonable person has just asked that they be given the time to establish the facts. They have duty of care, of course, to all their employees and their families. And we just ask that things are done properly. And, if you're talking about ruining reputations and lives, and look at all the other abuse the other presenters have had, surely there has to be more facts and evidence, because what's gone on in the last few days is truly terrible and not fair.
Now, we don't know where this is going, and, just judging from the last hour, things can change very quickly. But I just wonder, you're a PR man, what advice would you give to the unnamed presenter in this? How should he sort of be trying to deal with this, do you think?
Well, whoever they are, my strong advice to them at the moment is do nothing. It is not now for you to do anything. The BBC, as your employer, has a duty of care to you and your family to examine these things properly. It has a duty of care to all the other presenters who've been maligned and traduced online. And the person involved, in the same way, if I'm dealing with an issue in the company that I run or in any other arena, proper process, it takes time. And I think the whole country needs to look at itself as to what is the news agenda today, and just give this story some time for facts and look at the other things going on in the world. Because I'd say the same if it was Sky. You deserve protection, your privacy, you deserve to be treated as decently as the next man or woman.
But how difficult is all this when you've got social media that is out of control on this story, that is, as you say, has caused problems for BBC presenters, and they are at a loss to know what to do about it? I mean, social media, it's got really good sides to it. There are advantages to it. But in situations like this, it's difficult to know what to think, isn't it?
It is difficult, and with the modern 24/7 media culture, the fact we've got so many different media platforms where a story can just multiply in seconds and minutes, the reality is that not everybody who has tweeted something defamatory is going to pay the consequences for that. There are too many. A BBC presenter today, I think it was Jeremy Vine, realistically said, "What am I going to do? Launch 70 lawsuits?" And the fact is, you've got the law as it stands. It is much easier to police it with traditional media. But again, I'd say to people using social media, be careful what you tweet and think twice, because ultimately, where lives and careers and reputations are at risk, you've got to be fair. You just can't throw out stuff without evidence. It will eventually catch you up. But, it is harder to police social media, of course, than traditional.
Yeah, and as I say, we'll see what evidence in this story does turn up. Kevin, thank you very much for coming on. Thank you.
Cheers, Mark.
I'm joined now by Mark Bukowski, a media industry commentator, also a PR and branding expert. Mark, good evening. And things are moving in rapidly in rather unexpected ways, because we now have this letter to the BBC, which the BBC have published, in which the lawyer for the young person involved in this, says, for the avoidance of doubt, nothing inappropriate or unlawful has taken place between our client and the BBC personality, and the allegations reported in the Sun newspaper are rubbish. So, I mean, the Sun have replied, but where do you think... I mean, I've got to say the Sun has replied. They say they've seen evidence that supports their concerns. I'll read out their statement a bit longer later. But where do you think things are, Mark, at the moment?
Well, I think it's a shock. I mean, I think this is sort of in this witch hunt, or this crowd obsession about, you know, who was this sort of person, this unnamed person, has somehow bonded the nation. And I think, as all previous speakers said, you know, we all need to have a long, hard look at ourselves. It's certainly now that the spotlight has moved from the BBC, and whether or not they were conditioned by the same protocols, will now move on to the Sun. I would find it very surprising, particularly in a post-Leveson world, that the Sun wasn't pretty sure about the story they were running, knowing that it was sort of dynamite. Other newspapers also had similar sort of hooks to this tale. So I'm really surprised it's got to this stage. But, you know, it comes back to what we are served, and it shows that in modern public relations, the crowd is driven by social media. It's trial by jury. I mean, we are driven by what we feel about a story, not what is the facts. And no one is given time. I've been doing media noddies on this last few days, and I've said, we don't know the facts. We don't know what this story has got, but everybody wants it because it gives everybody a certain amount of clickbait. But the people who are serving this information to us, who are serving this negativity, are the social media channels, are all those sort of channels that are not governed by the same regulations Sky or any national newspaper are governed by. It is a free-for-all, and people dive in. And this is where it gets to it. But reputations are on the line here.
Well, absolutely. But for all that social media has this power, this is about the Sun newspaper that is reported for 3 successive days, I think it is now. And they say in this statement, we've reported a story about 2 very concerned parents who made a complaint to the BBC about the behaviour of a presenter and the welfare of their child. Their complaint was not acted upon by the BBC. We have seen evidence that supports their concerns, says The Sun. It's now for the BBC to properly investigate. The interesting thing is, The Sun's story has been based on the word of the mother, apparently. This is a lawyer for the youngster. So one wonders what is actually going on. It's complicated.
Well, my first reaction to this story was, if there was a point of concern and there was this sort of level of sort of unease about it, why didn't the parents go to the police? Why did they turn to a national newspaper? If they were getting nowhere from the Sun, if they were getting nowhere from the BBC, they turned to the Sun, which I always had a very big question mark about it, because you're not going to get true justice. It imperils your potential for a legal action. So that always made me sort of ask questions about this. But I cannot believe, with the pressures of the old mainstream media and, as I said, a post-Leveson world, the Sun had to be pretty sure that they were following what they thought was a pretty good lead. And maybe that gave some indication about the headlines today that supposedly the individual not named was actually making frantic calls to the individual. There's a lot more to this story, and we're no reacting just as this has landed, but I think there's a lot more to unwind here, and it feels like a whole, you know, mini-series being played out in front of it, because the BBC were paralysed to a certain extent, and of course we leapt to a judgment around the BBC. Was it a failure inside the BBC? You know, we were all looking at the wrong way on this, and that is shame on all of us.
Now, you made the point very early on in this, how social media drives these things and drives them so quickly. What can be done, do you think, to curb the worst excesses of social media? Look, everybody's grappling with the same thing. What can be done without, you know, throwing everything out with the good side of social media? It's very hard.
Well, yeah, it is. But I mean, that is for us to look at. We are wedded to our devices. Many of the things we're given, particularly new AI engines, are for free. There's nothing in life, Mark, for free. There is a price to pay. The price that we pay is giving away our data. Every day that we put our phone down and don't look at it, ad tech is not making money. And whether it's any of the big giants out there, they want us to be connected with news. And we've seen the power of negative news being driven by social media channels. You know, our brain is tuned not for positive news, but to negative news. And that drives us to these Twitter flare-ups, to these pile-ons. And just think, we all need to sit back and think, how much money are we making for the social media channels? But because we're so dependent on it, and because it's an instant news wire going into us every day, we're wedded to our devices. And that behavior can only be changed from us, from what we do and how addicted we are. Now that, you know, for younger people, you know, this is a boomer's point of view. For younger people, they're digital natives on these channels, and they demand for it. But we've seen what's happened in the elections in America. We've seen the activations of things like Cambridge Analytica. We can see just how powerful it is to generate those emotions. And something like this is absolutely clickbait for everybody. And every time we click, we make somebody a lot of...
Right, and just briefly, in 30 seconds, what would your advice be to this unnamed presenter if you were giving out PR advice?
Well, I would say immediately take a very deep breath, you know, analyze and start building a strategy and thinking, don't make any fast moves at the moment, nothing to race to. I'm not sure if this is the end, or the middle, or the beginning of this, and actually think very carefully, because this person and a number of reputations have been sullied by this falsehood. And I feel also for the BBC that they have to look very carefully at their own structures. But for him, it is actually choosing very carefully how he makes his move. And actually, the power of that interview will be sought by everybody.
Yeah, Mark, thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme. We can talk now to Matthew Gill, who is a media lawyer at Howard Kennedy. And just to reiterate, Matthew, what we're talking about, the BBC have received this letter from the lawyer of the youngster involved in all this, saying that basically what has appeared in the Sun newspaper is rubbish, and I quote, "For the avoidance of doubt, nothing inappropriate or unlawful has taken place between our client and the BBC personality, and the allegations reported in the Sun newspaper are rubbish." Then you have the Sun insisting that they have evidence that supports their concerns, the concerns certainly of the parent, and their information came from the mother. So, well, you know, legally, where does this leave the BBC?
I think this leaves the BBC in a position where it needs to continue with its investigation. It likely will impact that investigation and the outcome of it, but I don't imagine it will stop or set off the investigation on a different course, because they will need to carry out the investigation as planned.
And what about the Sun newspaper? But because they've issued, you know, a pretty forceful response to this letter from the young person's lawyer, which has been, you know, published by the BBC.
Quite. There can be no doubt that the newspapers, particularly newspapers like The Sun and others, take very stringent steps before publishing allegations like this in their paper. They will have undertaken, you know, a significant amount of research and discussions with the mother of this individual to understand and to confirm that there was truth to it. However, newspapers do get things wrong occasionally. Sometimes they can be misled by a source who's come to them with a story. So while they are currently strongly defending their journalism, of course, it does throw into doubt whether that article and the allegations in it are true, if you have the individual at the centre of it saying that there was no wrongdoing or inappropriate behaviour. Right,
just talk us through this whole issue of the you know, the presenter not being named. What is the legal position around that? And is it about the law? Is it about, you know, post-Leveson sensitivities? You know, where, just talk us through that.
So over the last 10 years, there have been a number of cases go through the highest of our courts that have resulted in judgments by the courts that have explained that where there are allegations of criminal behaviour alleged, the media shouldn't report the names of the individuals alleged to have done those illegal things unless and until there is a charge. And that's because the courts have decided that that strikes the right balance between the privacy of the individual at the centre and the public interest in understanding and knowing the names of people alleged to have done wrongdoings, such as potentially those that we're hearing about over the last couple of days. And so that's why the media really struggle in these situations to name the people who are at the centre of allegations such as these. And while there are exceptions, sometimes the balancing acts that the media publications have to apply will allow them to name the individuals. The starting point is that these individuals have an expectation of privacy until they are charged. And that's where, at the moment, the publications are standing.
Yeah, and I get that. And that seems absolutely fair. And people, I think, would understand that. Where it gets much more difficult is social media and how, you know, this can be, it doesn't apply, it seems, on social media, or if it does apply, who's going to, you know, take anybody to court, who's going to pursue it, even though we have today one presenter, BBC presenter, has approached the police about it. But it's, I mean, it is the Wild West out there when it comes to things like this.
Yes, and the laws of defamation in the UK do apply on social media. And so false allegations about either the celebrity, the BBC presenter involved, or others could go before a court if one of those presenters decides to sue. Now, in reality, because so many people have been naming these naming celebrities, whether correctly or not, it seems unlikely that any person who tweets the name of one of these celebrities will be sued, but they could be. And certainly those who are tweeting the most or putting out the most false information do open themselves to the legal risk of being sued.
Yeah, how diligently do the police pursue this, though? I mean, there's this issue today. Someone well-known has spoken to the police, and the police are now talking about malicious communications. But, you know, in the grand scheme of things, how diligently do the police, you know, sort of patrol the social media world? And how, I mean, can it be properly patrolled by the police? It can't.
It does happen. You might remember a few years ago, you know, we see these incidences of people spouting racism online following football games, and those have gone to court and people have been prosecuted for the things that they have posted. And, you know, while racism is very, very serious, these other allegations, such as allegations of paedophilia, for example, might also attract the attention of the police. And clearly they've decided that in the case of the one that has been reported that we're aware of, they have decided that there is an investigation worth looking into.
And just this line in the statement from the Sun newspaper saying, "We have seen evidence that supports their concerns." Do you think it's likely now that the Sun will, you know, produce more? It's a question of whether they have more evidence or more material on this story.
I'm sure that if the Sun have more material, they will hand that to the police if they think there is a case to answer. But they will want to protect their source. And so that will be done only with the source's permission, except where there is potentially, you know, a real risk of criminal liability. I suppose the other thing is the Sun will want to show that their story is true if they have more evidence. And so I don't think there's any doubt that if there is more information that the Sun has, that we will see that in the papers over the next few days.
OK, Matthew, thank you very much indeed. And of course, we are talking about these allegations first reported in the Sun newspaper on Friday that a BBC presenter paid for explicit photos over a 3-year period, starting when the young person involved was 17. Now, this male presenter has since been suspended. The BBC say it's working to establish the facts. The Metropolitan Police then said this afternoon that it has met with representatives of the BBC over the allegations and is sifting through information to see if there is a crime involved in all this. Now, since then, the lawyer for the young person involved in all this has said in a letter, for the avoidance of doubt, nothing inappropriate or unlawful has taken place between our client and the BBC personality, and the allegations reported in the Sun newspaper are rubbish. The Sun has since said in reply to that, we have reported a story about 2 very concerned parents who made a complaint to the BBC about the behaviour of a presenter and the welfare of their child. Their complaint was not acted upon by the BBC. We have seen evidence that supports their concerns. It's now for the BBC to properly investigate. So that's where we are. Our correspondent Sadia Chowdhury joins me from the BBC. Sadia, what do we expect the BBC to do about all this? Where does the BBC think they are tonight?
Well, the BBC will no doubt want to carry on its investigation, looking into what happened, especially now that the Sun newspaper is alleging that its story was actually about BBC's complaints or conduct in terms of when it receives a complaint. So there are still lots of serious allegations and serious matters to be resolved, and no doubt the BBC will want to do that. But what an extraordinary day this has been, when it started off with thinking that we're going to have lots of clarity. Instead, we've seen lots of twists and turns in this story, with this latest letter to the BBC where the young person at the centre of this says that the allegations reported in the Sun newspaper are rubbish. The Sun, of course, has been reporting this for the last 3 days, but the letter says that the young person sent a denial to the Sun on Friday evening, saying that there is no truth to it.
OK, Sadia Chowdhury at the BBC, thank you very much indeed on this fast-moving story. That was the News Hour at 6. Thanks very much indeed for watching. Coming up, we'll have much more on this, well, extraordinary developments in the BBC story in the next hour, right here on Sky News.
It's 7 o'clock. You're watching Sky News Tonight. Our top story, a denial from the young person involved in allegations about a BBC presenter. The BBC says the alleged victim's lawyer says nothing inappropriate or illegal has taken place and the claims are rubbish. Earlier, the Metropolitan Police said detectives were assessing information to see if there's evidence of a crime. Well, coming up, we'll bring you the very latest developments on this breaking story. Also in the news tonight, parents tell of fear in the classroom as a school teacher is stabbed and police arrest a teenage boy on suspicion of attempted murder.
She just went, "Mum, I'm really scared." And I said, "I know, darling, but the police are there and sorting it out. I love you so much." And she said they had guns, they had armed police and the dogs were out.
President Biden arrives in Lithuania for a crucial NATO summit after declaring the UK-US relationship is rock solid. Plus, how to protect creatures of the deep as companies seek to mine valuable metals from the seabed. Hello there, a very good evening, and we start with new developments in the controversy over an unnamed BBC presenter who's alleged to have paid a teenager for sexually explicit photographs. A lawyer representing the young person involved is now reported in a letter to the BBC to have denied that anything unlawful or inappropriate took place. Before that denial was made public, the police said they were assessing information about the allegations and making more inquiries to establish whether a crime had been committed. Let's go to the BBC in central London, join Sajia Chowdhury. Sajia, I think it's fair to say that this is a twist no one expected.
No, on a day when we woke up thinking we might get more clarity on this story, it seems to have taken new twists and turns. A reminder that this all started with the Sun newspapers reporting about 3 days ago that the mother of a person who is now 20, but at the time the Sun says was 17, was being paid by a BBC star, a presenter, around £35,000 over 3 years to send sexually explicit images of themselves to this presenter. And over the last few days, we've had a few more details from the Sun newspaper. Now, the BBC say that they responded after getting new information on Thursday, and they responded by suspending the presenter. And we also know that they contacted the Metropolitan Police. Today, the Metropolitan Police say that they met with BBC representatives this morning. It was a virtual meeting. It is important to note that the Met didn't say that they'd spoken or even attempted to speak to the presenter involved or the person bringing the complaint forward. They said they spoke to the BBC representatives and decided that there was no investigation at the moment, but inquiries would continue. Now, also social media got involved with people online taking to Twitter and other platforms to come up with their own theories about who this presenter might be. There were some BBC presenters who had to come out and defend themselves and deny having any involvement in this. Nicky Campbell, this morning, the BBC 5 Live presenter, on his show talked about just the sheer amount of online hate that he'd received and the trolling that he said led him to speak to his lawyers and the police as well. So lots of action over the weekend over this story. And then this really significant development just an hour ago with the BBC saying that they'd received a letter from a lawyer representing the young person involved. And in that letter, the BBC said it said, "For the avoidance of doubt, nothing inappropriate or unlawful has taken place between our client and the BBC personality. And the allegations reported in the Sun newspaper are rubbish." It says the young person sent a denial to the Sun on Friday. Friday evening, saying there was no truth to it. Now, of course, these are really serious allegations because of the potential criminality under the Protection of Children's Act 1978. It is illegal to take or make or share or possess any indecent images of anyone under the age of 18. So these are really serious allegations that were being reported in The Sun, which is why the police were involved. But perhaps that sort of explains, now this letter sort of explains why the BBC were so careful in the way they dealt with this, taking time, because such investigations need to be done with a lot of time. And of course we know that people do change their minds after they've spoken to journalists. Sometimes people do change their minds. So I think what we may see now is yet more thorough investigations, not just by the BBC and by the Metropolitan Police, but I suspect also from the lawyers of the Sun newspaper.
Of course, and Sadia, it's difficult for you to answer this question, but do you think, given this revelation in the last hour or so, it's more or less likely that we'll get to learn the name of this presenter?
No, you're right. I wouldn't know how to answer that question. There are lots of laws in place for individuals to have privacy, especially, you would perhaps think, high-profile individuals who are already in the public eye, and, you know, this person has a career at the centre of all of this, and no doubt will want some privacy around this. But, you know, we have had some BBC presenters who have come out to deny it, who have spoken out publicly, and so we may hear, we don't know, we just don't know where this is going to go. This latest development came just about an hour ago. We're learning about it actually while we're on air. But it was a very serious allegation made. It had potential criminality involved in it, and certainly any individual at the centre of a story like this will want to make sure that their name is cleared. If they're innocent, they'll want to make sure that their story is heard, because, as I say, that allegation in the Sun newspaper was so serious. It had potential criminality attached to it. It involved getting the Metropolitan Police and the BBC to sit down and talk about it. So there will have to be some more meetings, no doubt, to figure out where this story originated, whether there is any truth to it, who said what, who knew what, and when.
OK, Sadra, thank you very much. I know you're keeping across developments outside the BBC there this evening, but for now, thank you. We'll return to you if anything else happens within the next couple of hours or so. We can speak to our crime correspondent, Martin Brunt, now. Martin, we know that the police have met with the BBC. They had a meeting and after that said that they haven't yet launched an investigation. Do you think this revelation changes anything for the force?
I don't think so at the moment. It's pretty standard practice for a police force, particularly the Metropolitan Police, because we've seen them do this before in high-profile cases, to announce that they are assessing the information that they've been given before they move to any kind of formal investigation or decide not to launch an investigation. I think the point we've just heard about, you know, we really don't know who knew what and when, and I don't think the police do at this stage. Their meeting with the BBC today was virtual. They didn't meet face to face, so it doesn't sound as though detectives have asked for or been given any documentation around this issue. Whether there is any documentation, I know the Sun has referred to bank statements allegedly seen by the child's mother that support the allegation that the TV presenter was paying money to the woman's child. Does that exist? Is that something that the police will be asking for? Undoubtedly, they'll ask for it because it's been published. Does it exist? If it does exist, it sounds like it could be quite damning evidence. And the Sun tonight, of course, saying that they have seen evidence to support the mother's concern. But this is really an extraordinary development, and it's difficult to see. I don't think, for a start, it will change the police approach. And And this has got to a point, probably a quite sensible point, where the police are now looking into it. And they will be very keen to talk to everybody concerned, the child's mother, the child's lawyer, the BBC, whoever at the BBC had the first contact with the mother. It is slightly strange that the mother, having been frustrated, in her words, by the initial BBC response, went to the Sun newspaper rather than going to the police. I suppose some cynical people might think that's explained by, the idea that public confidence in the police is so low at the moment. Who knows? But it's also difficult to believe, too, that the Sun ran this story without being pretty sure of its bona fides. We don't know what the Sun saw to support publication, but it says tonight that it did see evidence. Newspapers do not run these stories lightly these days. I mean, I used to work in Fleet Street in the Wild West days, when you could get away with an awful lot. You don't now. Post the Leveson inquiry and findings, there has been a new era of privacy, backed up not in direct privacy laws, but decisions made, particularly in one case by the Supreme Court, which effectively ruled last year that newspapers, anybody, cannot publish somebody under a police investigation until there are charges. So it's difficult to think that the Sun rushed into this without being pretty sure of what it was doing. And of course, the Sun knew where this story would lead. I mean, it was a huge story. And that's probably, or part of the reason why it ran it, because it was such a big story. So I really don't know where we are tonight. It's just got very confusing. It's the child's word, it seems, against the word of the mother. Why they should be at such odds is a real puzzle. But the police, Scotland Yard, now involved, and I'm sure they are the best people to get to the bottom of it.
And Martin, just briefly, you touched on the Sun's latest statement this evening. They say that we have seen evidence that supports the parents' concerns. It's now for the BBC to properly investigate. But it does seem, doesn't it, that the BBC and indeed the police don't necessarily have all the evidence that the Sun says that it has. What can the police do about that? Are they able to get hold of that dossier, even if the Sun doesn't want to pass it over?
Good question. I don't know, but certainly detectives will want to see it. And, it's difficult to know that the Sun could be investigated by the police because, of course, it's been very careful not to name the presenter about whom these allegations have been made. Will the Sun volunteer such evidence to the police or to the BBC? We don't know. I mean, at the end of the day, if the Sun are found to have not been cautious enough before publishing this story, the biggest punishment it could face is from its proprietor, who, as we know very well, moved very swiftly to close down the News of the World, a very successful money-making newspaper, when he, Rupert Murdoch, decided that the paper had behaved so badly over the phone hacking scandal. That is the sort of sanction the Sun might be more worried about than anything the police might want to investigate. But look, let's not rush to judgment. We've all rushed to judgment over the BBC's so-called tardiness in responding to the mother's complaints. Allegedly, the first complaint on May the 19th, the presenter at the heart of the allegations not suspended until the last 48 hours. So let's not rush to judgment over the Sun newspaper either.
OK, Martin, many thanks indeed. We'll come back to you later if there are further developments. But joining me now is David Banks, who is a media law trainer and a consultant as well. Good to see you. There you are. Thanks for joining us this evening. I mean, this story has given you many lectures worth of material for your students, hasn't it, in coming months and years. What do you make of this latest development?
Well, the story was already extraordinary, and then this latest twist has just exaggerated that even further. I've been doing interviews about this all day with various media organisations, and one thing I said a few times is there's always two sides to a story. We haven't heard from everyone involved in this, and I was really thinking about the presenter themselves. At the centre of this, that's one person we haven't heard from. It didn't occur to me that we were going to get something like this from the young person involved, and a statement like this, which just turns things on its head. But I think, as Martin said, an awful lot of people have been very quick to rush to judgment over the weekend, especially on social media, where we've seen multiple presenters traduced, dragged through the mud by various people. Lots of people rushed to judgment about that. This latest twist changes things, but we need to kind of take a deep breath and still think, who else haven't we heard from? And no doubt that's what the people like the BBC will be thinking about, and it's the sort of thing that the Metropolitan Police will be thinking about in their investigations, so that they can sift through the various versions of what's gone on in order to arrive at some sort of conclusions as to what exactly has happened here.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, of course. We do all need to take a deep breath and not rush to any conclusions. But of course, that is very difficult, isn't it, in the era of social media and the speed at which social media works?
That's absolutely right. And I think this is what's caught the BBC, is that once the Sun ran something on this story, it was and because of the way that privacy law operates, the name of the person at the centre of this can't be revealed. That's the trigger that allows social media to just run away with a story, and we get all sorts of people's names being dragged in, people guessing at who it might be. I even saw at the weekend people running Twitter polls with the names of 10 BBC presenters, inviting their followers to guess who it might be, and these are all household names, and all being libelled by the thousands of people who were repeating this, voting on it, retweeting it, enjoying it, and what they regarded as a bit of fun. But for the people at the other end, for the presenters, it was obviously incredibly distressing to have this linked with their names.
And David, over the years, you've studied, I'm sure, very closely how the BBC operates, how it works, its processes. It does explain a little bit, doesn't it, the BBC's caution in its statements when it made those statements, also its caution in suspending this presenter. And while many were ready to attack the BBC, actually now, in light of this new information, we look at things differently.
Yeah, I think that there was an early BBC statement which was a little bit opaque, talking about the difficulties of investigating, and I think that was the BBC alluding to the fact that there was certain information coming from the family and the parents, and possibly either different information coming from the young person, or possibly, and this is just kind of guesswork now, a lack of cooperation by the young person, because they regarded it as nothing untoward has happened, and it wasn't something that they wanted to proceed with or to cooperate with. And that was why that might have been what the BBC was getting at when it was talking about difficulties in investigating. So things perhaps become clearer as you get these statements and the sides of the story that I was talking about that come out, and it does change our perception of what's gone on and what's happened. But we still aren't at the end of this. There are still investigations going on. The BBC will no doubt continue with their investigation. The Metropolitan Police will continue with their examination of the matter to see whether it's something that warrants a full investigation. And we await the outcomes of both of those organisations. And also, I think we haven't probably need to hear more from the Sun, because they apparently went forward with this story. They apparently have been given a denial by the young person involved. And so what was their decision-making process in perhaps not reflecting that denial as prominently as some people might think that they ought to have? But as Martin again said, you know, the newspapers like the Sun do these things very carefully. I know the people in the legal department there, and I know the care with which they will have gone through the detail of this story before they took a decision to publish. So it'll be interesting to hear these things from these people when in due course.
Absolutely, and they're standing by their journalism tonight. But when I read the initial story in The Sun, it did strike me as rather strange that there was no evidence printed in there in terms of a bank statement, perhaps, or a pixelated image. There was none of that, was there? Which was unusual in a story like this.
It was, and if they'd had it, you might have expected it to be there, because it's quite powerful visually. You know, any news editor, any designer of a newspaper would put that kind of element in to attract the attention of readers, and also to back up the story. So one would have expected, if they had it, for it to have been present there. Now, that's not to say they haven't. We don't know. But it's unusual not to use it, but to in a redacted form, as you mentioned.
Really good to get your thoughts this evening on this breaking news story. David Banks, thank you very much. David Banks, a media law trainer and also a consultant. Well, do stay with us here on Sky News tonight. Plenty more still to come. All the reaction to the denial that anything illegal happened between a young person and a very well-known BBC presenter. We'll be talking to an expert in crisis management. That's next.
Well, I was flying from Greece. I was performing at a wedding, and I was with my wife, and we were halfway from Greece to Barcelona, where I was going to do some shows in Spain. And the plane just started to drop, and everybody's ears started to go. And the stewardess, there's no easy way of saying this, she completely lost her mind and was running down the aisle screaming at everybody, telling them to put their masks on. And everyone started to kind of panic around us, and it was a crazy scene. And then the captain came over the loudspeakers and said, emergency descent, brace, brace. And of course, this is the last thing you want to hear when you're 37,000 feet up. And it was a very kind of terrifying ordeal. And my wife and I just kind of looked at each other and had this kind of moment of, oh, is this it? Is this how this ends? And my wife and I were like, we have to. This could be it. So we have to tell the kids we love them. You know, the first thing that came into our heads was, we've got to leave a message for the kids. So we opened up our WhatsApp group with our kiddos. And we just said, you know, we don't know what's happening. The plane seems to be going down. We love you. We're proud of you. Please look after each other. It was really like harrowing, you know. And Chrissy, my wife, was just absolutely calm as a cucumber, and I was like a blubbering mess.
Hello there, welcome back. You're watching Sky News tonight. There's been breaking news in the last hour or so. The teenager at the centre of that BBC controversy has said via a lawyer that nothing inappropriate or unlawful happened. Well, joining me now is Kevin Craig, an expert in public relations and crisis management at the firm PLMR. Great to see you, Kevin. So you are an expert in crisis management. Who is this more of a crisis for, really, tonight? Is it the Sun? Is it the BBC? Is it the presenter? Is it this young person?
The biggest crisis as we sit here right now is for the Sun newspaper, who have gone to print with a story that is contested by the young person at the centre of it. And I agree with all the experts on here this afternoon, our national newspapers, they're very well versed in media law, they know what they're doing, etc., etc. But the consequences of that are quite extraordinary. And I am one of the few voices for the last 48 hours that hasn't been piling into the BBC saying, act sooner, get on top of the story. What story? You very eloquently just said that this is a crisis, in speech marks, with no evidence behind it thus far. And for that, they're piling into the national broadcaster. They're putting livelihoods and reputations and families on the line. I mean, what are we doing as a nation that we've gone this far so quickly with no evidence?
Well, The Sun is saying tonight that we have seen evidence that supports the parents' concerns. It is now for the BBC to properly investigate. So it may be a crisis for the newspaper, but they are standing by their story.
Well, fair enough, but the BBC has already said it's investigating. Thursday was when this really escalated. They've suspended a member of staff to whom they have a duty of care. But it's for the Sun now to put up or shut up, because the media have the power to ruin lives, and they've kick-started a crisis here with very little evidence or facts behind it. And think of the other presenters, never mind the individual under this situation. All those professionals like you who are in the public eye, who find themselves the subject of Twitter surveys. I mean, really? What's that about?
Yeah.
In whose name?
The presenter at the heart of all this, now this new information has come out, what advice would you give to him? Do you think it's more likely that he'll come out and say, look, it is all rubbish and let's move on? Or do you think it's actually less likely? He doesn't need to do that.
I don't think that they should do anything now. I think, and I say this as someone who founded a company with over 100 staff now, you have a duty of care. The BBC are doing this properly. They're taking their time, they've met the police. The person involved should not have to come out publicly and put themselves and their family until this process has been concluded.
Yeah, and what about the BBC? It does explain, I mean, you've touched on it already, it does explain the initial caution, doesn't it, in those statements and in suspending the presenter. And yet we've seen politicians go on air and really kick the BBC, haven't we? It's become almost a bit of a political issue in some areas. I mean, questions have to be asked about that as well, don't they?
They do. And
get your house in order to the BBC.
Yeah, and I think it's so easy to get people, whether it's the political class or commentators, to instantly wade in and form an opinion before they've even assessed the facts. And the lawyers have been getting this right in the last few hours, that there are a lot of people now going to be quite worried. They've piled in a way they wouldn't do face-to-face, that they wouldn't do in print, before any evidence. And all we ask of the national broadcaster, the People's Channel, owned by and accountable to the people of this country, is that it conducts its processes fairly and properly. A crisis is not a crisis without evidence. Right, everyone got so excited. It wasn't an aircraft disaster. It wasn't a violent incident. What had actually happened? The basics are still not there. It's extraordinary.
Well, all we had to go on was what was being printed in the Sun, isn't it? Stay where you are, Kevin, if you don't mind, because I want to bring in Steve Barnett. He's a professor of communications at the University of Westminster. He's also the author of a book all about the BBC, so the perfect person to speak to. Thank you very much for your time this evening. You've been following developments over the last hour or so. Where do you think this leaves the BBC?
I tell you something. This is not about the BBC anymore. It is a crisis, and it's a crisis for the Sun. And I think the questions that now have to be asked are not of the BBC. The questions that now have to be asked are about the Sun. how did they come to publish something on what is clearly very flimsy evidence that is now cascaded into the kinds of crises that your guest in the studio has been rightly talking about? What was the basis on which they published, what is it now, 3 days worth of front page headlines along with other tabloid newspapers? And what was the basis of it? And I think to some extent we know the answer. The reason behind it is because the Sun and its editor and its proprietor hates the BBC. And this was an opportunity to launch a kicking party against the BBC, which frankly they've done on multiple occasions in the past on the flimsiest of evidence. And I mean, I completely agree with your guests, the comments about the number of lives potentially that are being put at risk here. And forget about the BBC for the moment. This young man, who it appears did not want this story to appear and actually made those statements to the Sun, was completely ignored. So I would like to know now what is going to be done within the Sun's editorial team. What questions are going to be asked of Victoria Newton, the Sun's editor, who, let's remember, was the person who gave the green light to that disgusting article by Jeremy Clarkson? What investigations are going to be made by the so-called regulator of the press, IPSO, which is, let's not forget, owned by the press, paid for by the press, and run by the press, including the Sun's owners? Are they going to do anything? Are they going to lift a finger? So I would like to see some really searching questions asked, not about the BBC, who I suspect is doing a lot of soul searching internally about what's actually happened, but let's ask some really searching questions about the Sun, about and the kinds of culture that is going on within the tabloid press, which we've been told many times has changed over the last 10 years since the Leveson inquiry, but it still seems to be intent on, in some cases, quite literally destroying lives on the flimsiest of evidence.
Yeah, of course, the Sun did apologise for that Clarkson column. I just want to read what the Sun's response has been tonight. We've got their statement because I think it's worth bringing in one more time. They say, we have reported a story about two very concerned parents who made a complaint to the BBC about the behaviour of a presenter and the welfare of their child. Their complaint was not acted upon by the BBC. We have seen evidence that supports their concerns. It's now for the BBC to properly investigate. So they are standing by their journalism, Steve. But this is damaging. Sorry, do you want to come in?
Yes, I mean, I'd like to respond to that, which is, they say their child. Let's be clear, their child is an adult. Their child has agency. And, you know, we can all talk about, you know, I've got kids in their 20s and we do not always agree on things. And, you know, what right do I have to intervene on something that they may or may not have done, on which I might passionately disagree, and then a newspaper decides, regardless of what my children say, my grown adult children, to publish my disapproval and my judgment?
I suppose the problem is, though,
does not stand up.
Yeah, I suppose the problem is that, again, we're getting into the realms of speculation here, aren't we? Because we don't know what conversations were had with these two individuals and the Sun. They may have changed their story. We simply don't know. But what we can say is that this has all been a very tumultuous period for the BBC. And what does it do? You know the BBC, you've studied the corporation over the years. What does this do for the morale of journalists at the BBC and other members of staff, especially those who've been condemned by public opinion on Twitter and had to come out and defend themselves? I mean, it's very tough for them, isn't it?
Oh, incredibly tough. And particularly on a story where, and you're right, at the moment we're in the realms of speculation. I am pretty sure that there will be some very robust internal discussions within the BBC about what they knew, what they did, and whether they acted appropriately. And people are going to be looking at whether they responded appropriately and what decisions were made. And yes, of course, it's always difficult on stories like this within the BBC. I have to say, having watched the 10 o'clock news last night, the BBC does not help itself it's journalists are, they've got massive integrity. They believe in holding the BBC to account, but boy, do they sometimes go overboard. I mean, there was more coverage on the BBC about the BBC than Sky. And, I think there are times when actually the BBC could be a little bit more sceptical about some of these stories about itself than they tend to be. But you're right that it does cause turmoil. And in particular, it has put some, very well-known presenters, BBC presenters, under the spotlight, some of whom have had to issue their own denials in a way that is both incredibly uncomfortable and incredibly unfair. And think of all their friends, their relations, their children who have kind of just secretly wondered, is it them? Could it be them, etc. Yeah. And the kind of pressure that they've felt under to issue denials about a story that now it now appears has very little foundation at all. Yeah. That is the nature of a publicly funded broadcaster. You expect to be under greater scrutiny. But as I said at the beginning, please let's remember that The Sun and the tabloid press more generally has an anti-BBC agenda. This is agenda-driven journalism. It's careless journalism. It's journalism that needs to be more scrutinised. And ultimately, frankly, we need a much better independent regulatory system for the press that would prevent this kind of nonsense happening.
All right, Steve, we'll have to leave it there. It's very hard for the BBC, of course. They get criticised if they overdo the reporting, and they criticised if they underdo it, don't they? Especially when the story is about themselves. Steve Barnett, Professor of Communications at the University of Westminster, thank you very much. Kevin Craig still with us. Let's get a final thought from you. Do you agree with that assessment that this story in The Sun is partly about kicking the BBC?
There are lots of folk in many of the tabloids who do do enjoy having a very good dig at the BBC. I do think it's remarkable. I mean, I will say, and I'm not being polite, the way that Sky have covered this is very balanced. I've seen it for 2 days, fair both sides. He is right, the professor. The BBC sometimes goes overboard to show how fair and nuanced and uncorrupt it is. 7 Principles of Public Life, etc. And that it's remarkable, really. But I think the next step now is let the BBC do its inquiry, let the police confirm whether there is anything. It looks like there isn't, and then treat the BBC employees and their families like any other organisation and ask ourselves, is there really a crisis here now, or are there questions to be asked by one newspaper?
Yeah, OK. We appreciate those comments. Thank you very much. Kevin Craig, an expert in crisis management. Good to get your thoughts this evening. Well, what will be on the front of tomorrow's papers, especially The Sun, of course? This story is, of course, going to feature heavily, and we will have our extended press preview and news review from 10:30 with all of tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be Deputy Comment Editor at The Telegraph, Annabel Denham, and the political editor at The Guardian, Pippa Crerar. It is going to be fascinating. That at 10:30. Do stay with us here on Sky News tonight. Coming up after the break, a lawyer for the young person involved in the BBC presenter scandal is reported to have called claims by their mother rubbish. In a letter to BBC, we'll be discussing further the potential for that. Hello again, welcome back. You're watching Sky News Tonight. Let's get more on our top story and that sensational development in the story about an unnamed BBC presenter subject to allegations by a mother that he paid her teenage child tens of thousands of pounds for sexually explicit images. Well, a lawyer for the young person is tonight reported to have called those allegations rubbish in a letter to the BBC. Well, joining me in the studio is the legal commentator Joshua Rosenberg, who also used to work as the legal correspondent at the BBC. So another perfect guest to have on the programme this evening. And what a development, Joshua, this has been in the last couple of hours. And I suppose the first question is, where does it leave the BBC presenter, unnamed, who is at the heart of all of this? Where is he now legally?
Well, legally he's in the same position, but in terms of the allegations against him, it does put a different picture, doesn't it? Because, you know, the Sun has reported this, but the lawyer, and this is apparently a well-known large legal firm that's representing this young person, says nothing inappropriate or unlawful has taken place between our client and the BBC personality, and the allegations reported by the Sun are rubbish.
Well, there's no ambiguity there, is there?
No, absolutely clear. It's not just nothing illegal, but nothing improper, nothing inappropriate. Now, the BBC, like any employer, owes a duty to support its staff or people who are there on contract who are in difficult circumstances. Equally, the BBC is owed a duty by its staff, and so there are duties on each side. But you wouldn't expect the BBC to throw somebody on its staff, out in those circumstances. Equally, you wouldn't expect somebody to damage the reputation of the BBC by misbehaving, and the only way through this is for the BBC to investigate this and find out the truth.
So do you think this revelation puts things in a different light for the BBC? Do you think there will be perhaps more sympathy now for the corporation in how they've dealt with this?
I do, because, don't forget, these were only allegations by the mother, the parent of this young person. And now we have a response, which, to be fair, is only an allegation on behalf of the young person. And it sounds as if they can't be both telling the truth. It wouldn't be the first time that people have disagreed. It wouldn't be the first time that parents and their offspring have disagreed. So it is a question of trying to get to the truth. And I think perhaps it does justify the BBC not rushing into this. It certainly justifies media organisations not naming the individual who's at the centre of this, the BBC presenter. It certainly shows the folly of people speculating on social media and the dangers of so doing. And at this stage, the police are not opening a formal investigation as we understand it. They're simply inquiring about whether there may have been a crime. They obviously are not going to take it on the strength of this young person saying no, nothing illegal took place. But on the other hand, if this person is said to be the victim of a crime and this individual is saying that no crime took place, well, it's obviously something the police have got to consider.
Where do we stand with all that now? We know that the police and the BBC have had a meeting to discuss what the position is. The BBC isn't certainly says it's not investigating formally at the moment, but it would appear, wouldn't it, that there is a body of evidence somewhere, whether the Sun has some sort of dossier or it has some sort of information which it hasn't necessarily shared with the BBC. Certainly the BBC seems to be saying they've not had all that information. We don't know whether the police has had anything from the Sun. It's pretty crucial, isn't it, that evidence? Yeah. And are the police able to get hold of it from the Sun, even if the Sun don't wish that to happen?
Well, they will certainly ask the Sun, won't they? And if the Sun, I imagine the Sun would want to cooperate, provided it can protect its sources and all that sort of thing, and its journalistic scoops and so on. So they will certainly want to, the police will certainly want to find out what's going on. Equally, the police can presumably go to the mother, the parents, and say to them, well, what's this all about? What can you tell us? And they will presumably also want to go to the young person and ask the young person what this is all about. The police are obviously capable of asking these questions. Whether the two sides of this argument will want to talk, we don't know. And quite what the BBC presenter has to say. Again, we don't know what the BBC presenter has told the BBC. So lots of unknowns. And from the police point of view, I think the first thing they'll want to do is see whether the evidence, as alleged in The Sun, discloses any criminal offences. Because we know that the Protection of Children Act deals with children defined as people under the age of 18. This young person is said to be 20 at the moment. If these allegations are true and if they relate to a time when the young person had become an adult, become 18, well, presumably there's no offence under this particular act, which was set up to deal with child pornography. So all sorts of questions to be asked.
I think The Sun is saying that this person was 17, weren't they, at the time? So they would fall within that parameter?
Yes, that is exactly what The Sun's saying. Of course, we don't know what happened. This is said to be something that went on over a period of years. We don't know whether any alleged offences were committed when the individual was 17 or when the individual turned 18. We don't know. And that's, again, the sort of thing the police would want to know, and they would want to take legal advice. So lots of very difficult things. I think the BBC deserves some understanding for the difficult position it's found itself in. It may have mishandled it. It may have failed to investigate this properly 2 months ago. But equally, it is not rushing into throwing its presenter under a bus by naming him. It's not telling us what it's found out so far, because it perhaps hasn't found out everything it wants to find out. It's being cautious. And I suspect we'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah, and just very briefly, Joshua, where do you see it? I mean, it's impossible to say, really. No one predicted this twist. Where do you think this will now go over the next few days? Do you think things will calm down as people accept that an investigation is continuing?
Well, I do hope so. There was all sorts of speculation going around today about what might happen, but nobody expected this. So I think, ministers were on your programmes earlier today and elsewhere saying the BBC's got to deal with this promptly, but it's also got to deal with it efficiently and fairly.
OK, great. You're ideally placed to speak to us as a legal commentator and someone who worked for the BBC. Thank you very much, Joshua. Great to see you this evening. Do stay with us here on Sky News. Coming up after the break, a lawyer for the young person involved in the BBC presenter scandal is reported to have called claims by their mother rubbish in a letter to the BBC. We'll be getting more reaction to this developing story.
Play Sky News.
From the Sky News Centre at 7.
Now that you're up to date, we can go into a bit more detail.
Things can change incredibly quickly.
Taken by surprise.
Have you ever known a moment like this in British politics before? Yes. Cheers.
We'll start with breaking news.
Let's get the latest on the ground.
So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better.
They have breached the road. There is a lot of gas being fired all around us.
शांति से इनको समझाओ वरना ये हम लोग
It is an absolute carnival kind of atmosphere out here for Prime Minister Modi's decisive victory. These students are defying the prohibitory orders and now they're going to be arrested. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. The roads have been inundated. The only way out is to get people by boat. What is feared that over 200 people might have died because of these landslides. This on any given day would have been bustling with people, but today it's absolutely deserted. This is one of the most sensitive areas of northeast Delhi where there's been clashes. I'm Neville Lazarus and I'm Sky's reporter based in Delhi.
Hello there, welcome back. Let's return to our top story. And a lawyer for the young person involved in the BBC presenter scandal is reported to have called claims by their mother rubbish in a letter to the BBC. Well, joining me now is Jonathan Code, who is a media lawyer, regular face on Sky News of recent days and weeks. Jonathan, good to see you. I'm sure, like the rest of us, you couldn't quite believe this latest development.
No, it popped up on my news alert and it was extraordinary. I mean, this is already a situation which is remarkable in many ways. But for the lawyers acting for someone who's not a minor now, who's 20, who's therefore in a position where she should be able to make her own decisions, for there to be a firm denial from her lawyer, i.e. from the alleged victim, describing the allegations as rubbish is an absolute bombshell. And of course, what it does is put the Sun right back on the back foot. The Sun has already gone into defensive mode, but all the potential ramifications of this are extraordinary. I mean, I can start to explain if you like. I mean, the first thing is that the Sun, it does, I think, have some explaining to do. If they were provided with good evidence that warranted an investigation, it should just as well have gone to the police as to the BBC. I mean, it's difficult really for the BBC to investigate. That isn't really what they do. That's what the police do. Now, I've dealt with the Sun for 30 years, and it certainly has been my experience that if they have something which warrants an investigation by the police, they generally will send it to the police so that they then have a certain degree of legal protection by reporting the police are now investigating. But they've not done that. And to jump up, down and say, well, the BBC should investigate, well, why haven't they investigated? I mean, if they're in touch with this lady, then there's plenty that they can do. Now, the other significant thing is that given what they've said is they've decided to not to name this individual. Now, I can imagine the tense conversation between the Sun lawyers, who I know, and Victoria Newton, where they all have decided on Friday, well, dare we name this individual or not? Now, they decided not to, and what that suggests is that they're not absolutely sure of their ground either. So the situation has suddenly become very fluid.
Yeah, it has. And we should just say, shouldn't we, at this point, certainly as far as I'm aware, we don't know whether this young person is male or female. We are running out of time towards the top of the hour, Jonathan, and I just wanted to ask you, you represented Philip Schofield, of course, a very different case. Where does this leave the presenter at the heart of all of this? Of course, there were rumours about Schofield for months before it became clear, the story became clear. Do you think this presenter will out himself, if you like, and now that this revelation has come to light, or would you advise him not to do that?
No, definitely. Yes, I did act for Philip, but assuming that the celebrity presenter in question denies the allegations, and in that they've been described as rubbish, the denial may be entirely credible. I can think of no good reason to invite the extreme outrage of the social media, which will land on him in clumps, 6 inches thick, because out there will be plenty of people who will say, well, you don't care who's denied it or not. There's smoke, so there must be some kind of fire. So I would definitely not out myself, and I would advise him not to if he was my client.
Have you been surprised at the level of social media speculation?
No. I regret to say, as someone who's acted for a high-profile client, actually I'm acting for another TV presenter at the moment who's been the subject of this kind of allegation. Actually, funnily enough, two. No, I regret to say that, that there are an awful lot of vicious and unwise people out in social media who seem to take on the role of judge and jury. And whereas just as there have been several BBC presenters who've been supposedly outed on social media, who've had to look at whether they've got a legal right to sue these people in defamation. The social media is an absolute area of mayhem, and for all celebrities, it is a nightmare, which unfortunately now goes with being a 21st century figure of interest.
Yeah, and of course the social media world moves so quickly, doesn't it, where investigations and the preparation of statements by the BBC or whoever it is takes a lot longer. Great having you on, as always, Jonathan. I'm sure we'll speak to you again in the next couple of days or so. Jonathan Code, media lawyer, thank you very much. Well, do stay with us here on Sky News tonight. Plenty more still to come in the next hour, including a lawyer for the young person involved in the BBC presenter scandal who's reported to have called claims by their mother rubbish. It's 8 o'clock. You're watching Sky News Tonight. Our top story, a denial from the young person involved in allegations about a BBC presenter. The BBC says the alleged victim's lawyer says nothing inappropriate or illegal has taken place, and the claims are rubbish. Earlier, the Metropolitan Police said detectives were assessing information to see if there's evidence of a crime. Well, coming up, we'll bring you the very latest developments on this breaking story. Also tonight, parents tell of fear in the classroom as a school teacher is stabbed and police arrest a teenage boy on suspicion of attempted murder.
She just went, "Mum, I'm really scared." And I said, "I know, darling, but the police are there and sorting it out. I love you so much." And she said they had guns, they had armed police and the dogs were out.
President Biden arrives in Lithuania for a crucial NATO summit after declaring the UK-US relationship is rock solid. The Chancellor will set out a major reform of pensions in a speech this evening in the City of London. We'll bring you that live. Plus, how to protect creatures of the deep as companies seek to mine valuable metals from the seabed. Hello there, a very good evening, and we start with extraordinary developments in the controversy over an unnamed BBC presenter who's alleged to have paid a teenager for sexually explicit photographs. A lawyer representing the young person involved is now reported in a letter to the BBC to have denied that anything unlawful or inappropriate took place. Well, before that denial was made public, the police said they were assessing information about the allegations and making more inquiries to establish whether a crime had actually been committed. Let's head to the BBC, join our correspondent Sajia Chowdhury, who is there for us. Sajia, this is quite the twist this evening. Where does it leave the BBC tonight?
Facing lots of questions, no doubt, but also with questions of their own, because this was a day that started off where we thought we would get lots of answers and figure out where this story was headed, and instead these extraordinary developments over the last few hours have left this whole thing far more complex. A reminder that this all started with the Sun newspaper reporting over the last few days that the mother of a young person had said that that young person was paid by a BBC presenter to send sexually explicit images of themselves to him. The Sun revealed small details throughout the weekend about these allegations. Now, the BBC responded by saying that on Thursday they received new information which led them to suspend a male presenter, and they said that investigations had started. We also know that the BBC contacted the Metropolitan Police, and this morning the Metropolitan Police met with BBC representatives in the afternoon. They issued a statement saying that they were assessing the situation, that inquiries were ongoing, but that no investigation was being undertaken. Now, it was important that when the Met said that, they didn't say that they had spoken to the male presenter or indeed the people or the person bringing forward a complaint. But it was indicative that something may have been amiss, that they said that they weren't investigating it. And of course, we also had lots of involvement from social media, with people taking to social media platforms to draw conclusions of their own. It's not right that anyone should name the individual at the centre of this, the presenter, because of defamation and privacy laws. But one might say it is okay for people to want to know who it is, because it is a national broadcaster, it is a publicly funded broadcaster, and the allegations were made in a British newspaper, and one expects them to have gone through lots of checks and balances before they make any sort of publication alleging that. Well, of course, the claims in the newspaper were very serious. They have potential criminality attached to them, which is why the Metropolitan Police had to be involved. It is an offence, and it is illegal under the Protection of Children Act in 1978 to make, take, share or possess any indecent images of anyone under the age of 18. Now, tonight, that letter from the lawyer that the BBC says that for the avoidance of doubt, nothing inappropriate or unlawful has taken place between our client and the BBC personality, and the allegations, it says, reported in the Sun newspaper are rubbish. Now, the BBC says that the young person in this letter says that they sent a denial to the Sun on Friday evening, saying that there was no truth to it. The Sun now seems to be saying that their reporting is about the fact that the BBC didn't take the initial complaint made in May more seriously, and that the parent of this young person had concerns about that. People we know do change their minds when they've spoken to newspapers, indeed even when they've spoken to the police, but these, remember, were very serious accusations, and no doubt BBC and the Met, and I suspect the lawyers for the Sun newspaper, will want to carry out more investigations.
OK, Sajia, outside the home of the BBC in central London, thank you very much. Well, let's get more analysis now of the latest developments in this extraordinary story. Here is our home editor, Jason Farrell.
At the centre of this, an anonymous BBC personality, alleged to have paid a teenager for explicit photos. But now a twist. A lawyer representing the young person says it's not true. In a letter to the BBC, it states, "For the avoidance of doubt, nothing inappropriate or unlawful has taken place between our client and the BBC personality, and the allegations reported in the Sun newspaper are rubbish."
I had been surprised all along that the Sun never showed any paper evidence, shall we say, no paper trails such as a bank statement to support their allegations. But they are, if you like, as you said, standing by their journalism. And this is actually a pretty big moment for British tabloid journalism as much as it is for the BBC.
A spokesperson for The Sun said, "We have reported a story about two very concerned parents who made a complaint to the BBC about the behaviour of a presenter and the welfare of their child. Their complaint was not acted upon by the BBC. We've seen evidence that supports their concerns. It's now for the BBC to properly investigate." It was 7 weeks after the first allegation was made about this presenter to the BBC that they decided to inform the police, and only after the first article appeared in the Sun newspaper. But the BBC says that the allegations in the newspaper were new and of a different nature. And following a virtual meeting between the police and the BBC, the Met Police said there was no investigation at this time. They were still seeking evidence that a crime had been committed. Furthermore, according to the lawyer's letter to the BBC, the alleged victim told the Sun newspaper on Friday that this story was untrue. And that's led to calls for the tabloid to produce its evidence.
If you're talking about ruining reputations and lives, and look at all the other abuse the other presenters have had, surely there has to be more facts and evidence, because what's gone on in the last few days is truly terrible and not fair.
The Sun's article and anonymity of the BBC personality sent rumours swirling on Twitter as people posted their own libellous theories on who the mystery presenter was. Nicky Campbell, among many, forced to announce it wasn't him.
But it was a distressing weekend. I can't deny it, for me and others falsely named. Today, I'm having further conversations with the police in terms of malicious communication and with lawyers in terms of defamation.
Jeremy Vine, another.
We know that the person has been suspended, so by virtue of talking into this microphone, I can't believe I'm even having to say this, it can't be me.
This process of elimination by on-air appearance only shortens a fairly short list of people it could be, and there's still pressure on the BBC.
When were you first made aware of allegations against the BBC presenter?
The acting BBC chair not answering. But the corporation's processes still need to be scrutinised, and the police still need to ensure there was no crime. Jason Farrell, Sky News.
So that's a summary of where we are this evening. Let's bring in our crime correspondent, Martin Brunt. Martin, we know that the police and the BBC have had a meeting. They've discussed the specifics of what's been going on. The police say that they haven't launched any sort of formal investigation. Does this change anything in terms of the police?
I'm not sure that it does initially. I mean, these extraordinary allegations have been investigated twice already, if you want to see it in those terms, by the BBC and by the Sun newspaper. And, you know, I'm not suggesting we should believe one of those over the other, but I think the fact now that the Metropolitan Police is involved, even if it's not a full-blown investigation. It's an investigation of sorts. They are assessing what information they've got or will get or will ask for. And that's probably the best place that it should be happening, shouldn't it? I mean, the Metropolitan Police better equipped than the Sun and the BBC to get to the bottom of it. But principally, the police will be most concerned in establishing whether a crime has been committed. And if at the end of it, the police decide that there was no crime, well, where does that leave everybody? It might perhaps vindicate the BBC because it, didn't go overboard for those early weeks. It didn't suspend its presenter until quite recently. And if there's no crime, perhaps the BBC were absolutely justified in the way it tackled this, at least initially. I mean, as you've heard in Jason's report, the BBC said that up until the last few days, it was looking at quite different allegations and apparently less serious allegations than what emerged in The Sun on Friday. And where would no crime leave The Sun? Well, The Sun hasn't named the person that was at the centre of these allegations. So perhaps The Sun too will escape any. Well, I can't imagine The Sun would be subject to any criminal sanction, but it could if it did ignore the alleged victim's plea that none of this was true on the eve of publication. It could be seen perhaps to have published frivolously or without due care and attention, and might attract some sanction from IPSO, its regulators. But perhaps if The Sun is deemed to have behaved very badly, then its proprietor, Rupert Murdoch, might decide to take some sanction, as he has done very heavily in the past, of course. But let's not rush to judgment. Up until tonight, everybody was rushing to judgment about the way the BBC has behaved, and I think it would be wrong to rush to judgment in the way that The Sun has handled it. The Sun is robustly defending its position. Let's see what's in the paper tomorrow.
Yes, and we will find out at 10:30 in the press preview. Thank you very much indeed, Martin. Let's get more analysis now from Nigel Pawley, who is a media commentator, also a former Fleet Street showbiz editor. Good to see you this evening. Well, let's investigate a couple of those points that were made there by Martin. First of all, does this latest revelation, do you think, vindicate the BBC in some way when it faced so much criticism, didn't it, for not suspending this presenter sooner, and also for not being quicker off the mark when it comes to issuing statements?
It would definitely explain why the BBC had been slow in coming off the mark and making the statement. This story is obviously a lot more complicated than it first appeared. It's the statement today from the youth's lawyer have definitely thrown the cat amongst the pigeons. Now, The Sun, in their original story, said that they had affidavits from the parents about what they have said, and affidavits normally are fairly legally tight. That means that the Sun lawyers were happy with what was said. What will come out now is whether this rebuttal from the youth was ignored. And that's going to be an issue, I think. It has complicated things. The Sun reported a story. The Sun are saying that they were reporting the concerns of parents, which is perfectly understandable. If you look at it, that they felt the BBC hadn't acted quickly for their drug-problemed child. But if you look at how social media has run with it, reputations have been trashed, and it's unleashed this sort of horrendous Pandora's box of accusations, people having to go on Twitter to say it's not me. That's the issue here, that it's not just about this story, it's about a lot of other aspects that have been involved. Aspects almost like people used to go to Bedlam to laugh at lunatics, and people used to go to see public floggings. This has been BBC personalities absolutely trashed over the weekend on social media by people who had no evidence whatsoever. The Sun were very careful in their story. They were very careful. I mean, as one of your previous guests said, it was very strange that there was no documentary evidence showing bank statements, showing pictures. That should have set alarm bells ringing, that it was people saying there was concerns, but they weren't necessarily all on board with it. Yeah, so there's obviously some sort of family issues
sorry,
going
Nigel.
on here as well.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, Nigel, but with your experience of Fleet Street and being a showbiz editor and a journalist for a long time, were you surprised when you read that first article by The Sun? Because it was all about a person who's now 20 years old, was 17 at the time of the allegations, but a 20-year-old person who wasn't quoted in the article, and yet their mother was quoted in the article. It's strange, isn't it, to write a huge bombshell piece for the front page without actually speaking directly to the main person involved?
It did seem strange, and it also seems strange that they described it as a child. There was no gender attached to the person. And as you say, the person was at 17, allegedly. But the website on where they actually met has an age limit of 18. So there again is a defence or an issue for the personality involved, that they can write, they can say, well, if they're on that website, that the website, you have to be 18 to be on it. Very, very complicated, this. We've seen Philip Schofield and ITV, run through and his career crash and burn within a month. It's not very nice seeing the sort of hounds unleashed on people. The BBC personality must be going through hell. I mean, what do? Do you now come out and say, this has happened to me? I'm sure they're speaking to lawyers. I'm sure they're speaking to people like me. I'm sure they're speaking to, sort of crisis management PRs to try and find out what is the best way to approach this. Because you can't keep sitting there with names bandied about on social media without actually some recourse to try and get your side over, or at least say, hold on a minute, I'm innocent of this. This is a story that's there, but it's not as people say, as it first seemed.
Well, it does start to get a bit ridiculous, doesn't it, when names are bandied about on social media day after day, and yet we don't hear from that specific person. What would your advice be? Would it be now, given the latest revelations this evening, that presenter comes out and says, look, I've been hounded, I'm completely innocent, let's all move on? Or, I mean, we've had commentators on the programme this evening saying, actually, no, the advice should be keep absolutely quiet and stay where you are and until everything is done and dusted in terms of any investigations.
There are two ways. It's tricky, and depending on which sort of crisis you would go on. In some ways, some people would want to come out and say, this has happened to me. But by the same token, once your name is out there, the floodgates really will open. So at the moment, I guess sitting tight would be a good thing. I'll be interested to see how the Sun doubles down tomorrow and what they say and how they report it. Bearing in mind things have changed since Max Mosley and Cliff Richard. Privacy now is very, very difficult for newspapers. You can't just put allegations. This person would have been named 20 years ago, 10 years ago, possibly. Things have changed, quite rightly, some would say. And in this case, this exactly shows why people's privacy is important, why it is important for all the facts to be there before throwing people to the wolves, because this person's career is hanging by a thread at the moment, and it may well be that they are not quite as guilty of what was first alleged. This was a fantastic headline, and sometimes headlines and the stories are written around them. This seemed to me to be a fantastic headline. BBC personality paying for dodgy pictures, lots of money to a drug addict. However, the reality is, what's the substance of the story? And that's what's going to be unravelling over the next few days.
Yeah. Nigel, have you spoken in the last few hours to any of your colleagues in the industry, maybe anyone you know at The Sun? I mean, how are they feeling about this? Because in their statement, they are standing by the journalism. But are there some nerves, do you think, in the newsroom? Are The Sun's lawyers nervous tonight, do you think?
They will be. I mean, I've worked on newspapers where we've broken big stories and, things about Clarkson, things about, and it is worrying when you're convinced that your story is correct and your sources are correct. You have affidavits, but there's always a doubt at the back of your mind, what is going to be there. So I'm sure The Sun and their lawyers are convinced that their original story was fine, and subsequently, but it's what's gone on from there that's been the problem, how other papers have covered it, and how people on social media have covered it without any evidence whatsoever. If you notice, The Sun have been very careful in not overplaying this story. They've let the story itself go in the paper. They haven't done a big sell on it, really, because I think they realise the intricacies and problems connected to it. So yeah, they will be risky. The basic fact is the editor of The Sun will be worried because, as you mentioned earlier, Rupert Murdoch is not very happy to have his papers pulled through various other things after Leveson and all the other things that have happened. This is not what he wants. Just as the BBC don't need a scandal, the Sun don't really want privacy issues at this particular time. So, you know, there will be people not sleeping well tonight. I'm sure that having spoken to a couple of mates who work on that particular paper and also on the Times, they are interested. The lawyers there have been very busy today. They normally would be just looking through the paper for what's happening tonight, but they've been slightly preoccupied. And I'm sure the journalists who wrote it are excited at having probably the story of the year, but they must also now be rechecking their notebooks, and lawyers have probably been quizzing them endlessly, as you do when you have these sort of issues. You do spend hours with lawyers showing your notes, showing your tapes, and trying to explain exactly how you got the story and what was said, who said what. And that can be quite grueling and quite nerve-wracking as well.
Yeah, I'm sure the journalists are relieved that they took their lawyer's advice and didn't name this presenter in that initial story. And this is a perfect example of why you wouldn't want to do that. Nigel Pawley, media consultant, former Fleet Street showbiz editor. Great to get your thoughts and insider information. Thank you very much. We'll speak again, I'm sure. Well, we're going to have more on this a little bit later in the hour, at 8:30, in fact. I'll be speaking to Nazir Afzal, former chief Crown prosecutor for the CPS in the northwest of England. That'd be fascinating to find out what they have to say. And there's going to be more, of course, in tomorrow's papers. What will the front of the Sun look like, I wonder? We will have our extended press preview and news review, as always, from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be Deputy Comment Editor at The Telegraph, Annabel Denham, and the Political Editor at The Guardian, Pippa Crerar. It'll be fascinating to get their thoughts on events over the last few hours. You're watching Sky News tonight. Coming up after the break, in other news, a teenager is arrested on suspicion of murder after the stabbing of a school teacher in Gloucestershire. Don't go away.
Well, I was flying from Greece. I was performing at a wedding, and I was with my wife, and we were halfway from Greece to Barcelona, where I was going to do some shows in Spain. And the plane just started to drop, and everybody's ears started to go. And the stewardess, there's no easy way of saying this, she completely lost her mind and was running down the aisle, screaming at everybody, telling them to put their masks on. And everyone started to kind of panic around us, and it was a crazy scene. And then the captain came over the loudspeakers and said, emergency descent, brace, brace. And of course, this is the last thing you want to hear when you're 37,000 feet up. And it was a very kind of terrifying ordeal. And my wife and I just kind of looked at each other and had this kind of moment of, oh, is this it? Is this how this ends? And my wife and I were like, we have to. This could be it. So we have to tell the kids we love them. You know, the first thing that came into our heads was, we've got to leave a message for the kids. So we opened up our WhatsApp group with our kiddos. And we just said, you know, we don't know what's happening. The plane seems to be going down. We love you. We're proud of you. Please look after each other. It was really like harrowing, you know. And Chrissy, my wife, was just absolutely calm as a cucumber, and I was like a blubbering mess.
Welcome back. A teenager has been arrested following the stabbing of a teacher at a secondary school in Tewkesbury in Gloucestershire. It happened shortly after the start of the school day, and the school said a male member of staff needed hospital treatment. Well, police were called to the Tewkesbury Academy in Gloucestershire just after 9 o'clock this morning. The school was locked down for a number of hours while police searched for a suspect. Then at 11 o'clock, firearms officers arrested a teenage boy in Stoke Orchard, a few miles from the school. Our correspondent Dan Whitehead reports.
It is a parent's worst nightmare. Your child's school in lockdown, police and ambulances surrounding the grounds. For hundreds of parents, this was the reality at Tewkesbury Academy this morning in Gloucestershire. Sarah's 13-year-old daughter Izzy was inside.
Just sat at home, I could hear sirens and I just couldn't sit at home, so I decided, I know you're not supposed to come, but you feel so powerless as a parent. You know, when something's happening with your children and you can't do anything about it. So we decided to come. And then she texted me back to just say that she's so frightened.
In those texts, Izzy told her mum, "It's really scary. We are stuck in a classroom. Mum, I'm really scared." "I know, darling," Sarah replied, "but the police are there and sorting it out. I love you so much." They had guns, Izzy added. They had armed police. Emergency services were called just after 9 o'clock to report a male teacher had been stabbed by a pupil in a school corridor. A widespread search for the suspect then began.
Specialist resources, including the National Police Air Service and plainclothes officers, were deployed to search the wider area, and thanks to their efforts, the suspect was safely arrested by firearms officers in Stoke Orchard at 11 o'clock this morning.
During the arrest, around 6 miles away from the school, a knife was seized. The motive behind this attack here is still unclear, but police say at this stage there is no evidence to suggest that it's terrorism related. The teenage boy is being questioned on suspicion of attempted murder. The teacher, named locally as Jamie Sansom, remains in a stable condition in hospital. For the parents, it was an agonising wait at the school gates to be reunited with their children. For Sarah and Izzy's sister Emily, a sheer relief to be back together after the most terrifying of days. Dan Whitehead, Sky News in Tewkesbury, Gloucestershire.
I've got some breaking news coming out of Vilnius, where the NATO summit is taking place. Jens Stoltenberg, head of NATO, saying on Twitter that he is glad to announce that after the meeting I hosted with President Erdogan and the Swedish Prime Minister, President Erdogan has agreed to forward Sweden's accession protocol to the Grand National Assembly ASAP and ensure ratification. This is an historic step, Mr. Stoltenberg says, which makes all NATO allies stronger and safer. So, breaking news this hour, following a meeting between President Erdogan and the Swedish Prime Minister, President Erdogan has agreed that Sweden can join NATO. This comes, of course, after there has been quite a block to that happening. All new members have to new members to NATO, of course, must be agreed by all members of the alliance. But Turkey has been stopping Sweden's accession, accusing it of harbouring Kurdish terrorist groups, particularly the Kurdistan Workers' Party. So that has been a stumbling block, but it appears that things have been resolved. Can we have a listen to a news conference that's currently underway? I believe we can. Let's listen in.
Thank you, Mikael Holmström, Dagens Nyheter, Sweden. You mentioned some kind of security pact between Sweden and Turkey. Could you please elaborate? And also have a second question, because there is another country, Hungary, which has not ratified the application. And I wonder, do you have any information or have you had any communication with Hungary on this matter? Thank you.
Well, Hungary has made it clear that they will not be the last to ratify, and now Turkey has made it clear that they will ratify, and there are only 2 countries that have not ratified. So I think that problem will be solved. Then on the security compact, well, that just reflects the importance of this day, because it reflects that the cooperation between Turkey and Sweden on fighting terrorism and working more closely together as allies will be brought to a new level. This is about high-level cooperation. It's about annual meetings, and it is about developing a roadmap as the basis for its continued fight against terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. So this just further strengthen and also create a stronger institutionalized cooperation between Turkey and Sweden to address common security concerns, and in particular the fight against terrorism. This was also something that was offered by the Swedish side and welcomed very much by the Turkish side. It's in line with and in the spirit of the agreement we made in Madrid, but an example of how we take the Madrid agreement further and develop more concrete implementation by agreeing the Security Compact.
Okay, Anna Dolu.
Thank you. Secretary General, can you please elaborate more about the function of the Special Coordinator for Terrorism? This is the first in NATO history you said. And what kind of work he or she will perform regarding the terrorist organization PKK?